All right, good afternoon again. Thank you very much for joining our workshop on understanding how knowledge works, practical steps for constructing research findings in PhD dissertations. Joining us today is Dr. Kirsten Wilmot, who is a senior lecturer and coordinator of the Higher Education Studies doctoral program at the Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. Kirsten has a background in sociolinguistics and has conducted research dealing with issues of identity, accent, social class, and language on literacy practices. Her PhD at the University of Sydney shifted her research focus into the sociology of higher education and the framework of legitimation code theory. Kirsten's current research focuses on developing theoretical tools for analyzing and understanding disciplinary knowledge building practices, with a keen focus on the practice of doctoral writing and supervision of doctoral research. Today, Kirsten will be speaking to us about understanding how knowledge works, looking at practical steps for constructing research findings in PhD dissertations. Just before handing over to you, Dr. Kirsten Wilmot, I would like to tell the participants today that I'll be posting a link to an evaluation form for you to please help us evaluate our workshops using that link, which is anonymous. That link and your answers will assist us in terms of assisting you and working together in ensuring that you guys are supported during your research time. Also, just a reminder to please register for our upcoming conference, which is taking place on the 1st and the 2nd of September here at Makanda. Registrations for the conference are in our website, and I'll also post the link. Registrations are very important so that we know how many people are coming in, because our venue has got limited seats. But without wasting any time, allow me to call upon Dr. Kirsten Wilmot to facilitate the session for us. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sipe. I'm just going to turn on my video for a second just so I can greet you all and you can know who this voice belongs to for the next.
You're muted. Or is it my side?
It might be your side. Can everyone else hear me?
I can hear you.
My side.
Brilliant.
Must be me.
Great. Thanks, Yane. Well, it's just so wonderful to be here. So thank you for having me, CPGS, again this year. It's been wonderful to collaborate with you, and thanks to everyone for being in the room this afternoon. I hope you are going to find the session useful. What I'm going to be sharing is from my PhD, which looked at doctoral writing and what makes for a successful thesis when it comes to writing. I'm going to give you some things to think about first and explain it, and then we're going to work through some texts, and hopefully what I've explained will come alive to you, and then we'll have a short opportunity just for some discussion towards the end. So bear with me if you're feeling like you are being spoken at. You will be for a little bit, but just bear with me and hopefully we'll get through it and that it will make sense to you by the end. And I'm going to try and keep my eye on the chat. If you have a question, if you want to interrupt me, please do so. Very happy to stop and take some questions on that. All right, I'm going to turn off my video now just to save on bandwidth. And it would probably help if I shared my screen as well. And then you know what we'll be doing. All right, so let's get started. One of the things that my own PhD did was look at a bunch of PhDs, 25 PhDs from South Africa across the humanities and social sciences. And it was trying to understand what makes successful writing in a PhD. And the first thing I want to say up front is that PhDs look very different. And if you're sitting in the room and you're doing your master's or your honors, don't despair. The strategies and steps I'm going to introduce today, you can use in your own research writing. I just happened to come up with them through looking at PhDs. So you are still in the right place. So what I found is, even though PhDs can look very different, they all essentially do 5 main things. They establish a rationale. So they tell the reader why a study is important. They explain the phenomena being studied, whether that be a literary text or the student experience, whatever it might be. There's something that's being studied. You explain how the phenomena was studied. You are then going to construct findings about that phenomena. And then you're going to demonstrate an original contribution to the field. So for today, we are going to be looking at the constructing findings bit. It's quite a crucial part of the PhD, because that's really where you are producing new knowledge and pushing the boundaries of the field that you're working in. But if you are interested by the end of this, if you think I've got something useful to say, then you might be interested to have a look at another workshop I did for the CPGS a few weeks ago that looked at literature reviews, and that's essentially about establishing a rationale. So I put the link in there. It's to the YouTube channel, and I will make these slides available. I'll ask the CPA to send them out after this workshop, so you will have access to this. All right, so today the focus is on constructing findings, and I've purposely chosen to use this image of Lego for the rest of the slides, because I really want to emphasize the point that findings don't just exist. They don't just exist. Data is not findings. Data is the start to creating findings. And so it really is an active process that you undertake in your writing, in your dissertation, to create them for your reader and to convince your reader that they are actually indeed findings. But let's have a look first to find out what literature and research is saying about findings. So what do we know from the research? So the research tells us that we need to show an ability in our dissertations to be able to build knowledge that can be decontextualized, transferred, and recontextualized into new contexts. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so if we are, say I'm doing a study on the student experience at Rhodes University, and I want to know why Rhodes students do or do not go to lectures. The insights I'm going to generate from that study are going to be about Rhodes and about this particular context and about our particular students. By the end of the dissertation, however, we need to be able to lift those findings outside of that context. That's what I mean by we need to decontextualize them. We need to show our reader the implications of those findings that can then be transferred and interpreted in different contexts. So I need to make sure that somebody reading those findings in India will be able to learn something from that and have a look at the implications in terms of their own context in India. And that's the way that your research contributes to growing the field. You have something to say about your context, but we need to present that information, that knowledge, in a way that has implications for other people. And so what we know is that theory helps us do this. Theory and abstract ideas helps us to do this, but they need to be connected to the contextual ideas. So that's what I mean when we've got really rich details about one context. We need to be able to abstract those out into other contexts in order for other people to make connections to what we're doing. And by doing that, it allows you to contribute to that broader conversation. So it's all about essentially creating links between the new knowledge that you are producing as well as existing knowledge that's already available in the field. So that's what we need to do. I think that's pretty straightforward. I don't think I'm telling you anything new at this stage, but what is important to understand here is that while this may seem pretty simple, pretty straightforward, it's a little bit more complicated when it comes to actually doing it. And so essentially what we are trying to do then is we're trying to strike a balance. So it's not one or the other. So it's not that you can only work with the rich detail of your particular context or work at a very abstract theoretical level. It's not a choice between those. It's actually moving between those kinds of knowledge and information. So it's moving between the rich detail and the more abstract ideas. And in that sense, it's about weaving different forms of knowledge together in your writing. But knowing this in theory is different to doing it, because what I found in my research is that it requires some steps and some steps to help you in your writing to do this weaving. And so I want you just to, for a few seconds, just consider briefly, as a student in your position now, have you ever been told by your supervisor that perhaps your writing is too descriptive? So have you ever got feedback, like in the margin, saying, this is a bit descriptive, I'm not really getting a sense of the implications here? Or perhaps the comment has been that the flow of your writing isn't very smooth, that it sort of jumps around between different ideas, particularly from descriptions and then perhaps your theory. So any kind of comments relating to that. Or a comment, another quite common one is if you receive a comment saying, you're expecting your reader to do a bit too much here, too much work. You need to do the work for the reader. Okay, if any of those resonate with you, then I think you're in the right place. If they don't resonate with you, then perhaps you are an excellent writer already, and that's amazing. I wish we could all be excellent writers from the beginning. But one of the reasons why you might be getting this feedback, and it might become clearer as this workshop goes on, is that you're essentially missing some of the steps. So perhaps you are staying within one sort of stage of your writing for too long, or perhaps you're jumping around. And it's very normal. I'm going to say this now as well. I'm going to come back to this point at the end, but it's very, very normal to not be moving across these steps right from the beginning of the writing process. And that should become clearer as we go, as I introduce the tool, but we will come back to those thoughts. So I want you just to keep those thoughts in your head and keep thinking of them as we go through, and then we'll come back to them at the end of the workshop. All right, so the focus today then is on figuring out how to move between the context of your research site or your case study and the broader field in which you are working in and contributing to. But in order to do that, we need to understand a pretty important characteristic of knowledge when we are constructing our findings. And this is the part I'm going to get a little bit abstract for a slide or two, and then we're going to start looking at this in a bit more detail. So just bear with me for another 5 minutes or so. So what we're going to be looking at briefly here is this idea of how context dependent the knowledge is that you're working with. And what I mean by that is the context dependency of the knowledge is really about how dependent are those meanings to the context in which they are produced. So how much do they rely on the context to make sense? And it's a relational context, and it's on a continuum. So if we think about that continuum as being really concrete meanings to really abstract meanings. Concrete meanings are those that are really dependent on their context. So if you have, for example, an excerpt from an interview transcript, just a few lines of what someone said in an hour-long interview, unless you have contextual knowledge of where that came from, what the question was asked, who the participant was, an outsider is going to really struggle to make sense of what's going on in that interview, particularly if it's just a quotation from that transcript, because it's so out of context. You don't know what came before, what's coming after, you don't know the question that got asked, you don't know the position the person was in, you don't even know who the person was. Okay, so that's what I mean by you've really got to be there, you've got to be part of it in that context to understand what's happening there. And that's slightly different to meanings that are not tied to any one context. So if you think of theories, the way theory works, it doesn't matter. Let me think of a theoretical concept to use an example. So if we think about Bourdieu and his concept of cultural capital, whether I use that concept here in my office at Rhodes right now, whether that concept is used in Australia or in China, the meaning that goes with that concept it stays the same. It doesn't matter where it's used or when it's used, the meaning stays the same because it's already abstract enough that it doesn't depend on the context in which it gets used. So that's the distinction we are making today. And I'm hoping that's going to become a little bit clearer as we move through. So with that in mind, what I did is I looked at PhDs, really successful PhDs that had been recommended to me by top people in the field as being the sort of gold standard, if you will. And what I realized is that thinking about the difference between abstract knowledge and concrete knowledge, what I was able to do is make a distinction between knowledge that comes from the context of the person's study and then knowledge that comes from contexts beyond the study. Okay, so that might sound really strange at the moment, but I'm going to go through these in more detail to make it clearer. So what do I mean by context of study? Let's start at the bottom there, looking at meanings produced in the context of the study. So I like to think of this as looking towards your study. You really are looking at the context of where your research is unfolding. And these meanings are going to be relatively strongly dependent on the context because they are containing all those rich details that are very specific to your research context. And they're going to include details that perhaps only pertain to your context. So again, if we go back to that example of why Rhodes students go to lectures, there are going to be certain details that are really special to Rhodes that perhaps you wouldn't find at Wits or WUSU or Forte or wherever. It might be really special to Rhodes and this particular context. And it's also going to be your understandings of those details. So not only what you find, but also how you are making sense of what you find in your research context. So that's what I mean by that first distinction of context of study. Now, the opposite of that would be context beyond your study, or perhaps not opposite, but on the other end of the spectrum. And that's when you are starting to look beyond your context. So in that example, it's when we start to look beyond Rhodes, beyond Makanda, beyond our lecture space, to start thinking, well, what else exists in the field? So these meanings are less dependent on any one context. And it's really about when you are looking out to and connecting up to existing knowledge in the field. And that is a way that you make your knowledge relevant and useful for others in the field. So it's about creating those connections for your reader between what have I found in my context, and now you're looking beyond your context to what actually exists there already. And in doing so, that is how you start to work at a more abstract theoretical level. And in doing that, that is how you start to push the frontiers of the field that you're working in. Okay, so again, not rocket science, but it's something to keep in mind when you are writing. But let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail to make it become clearer. So if we go back to building context-dependent knowledge, so you're looking towards your study. There's the little stick figure to remind you, you're now looking towards your study. There are two main ways that you can develop this kind of knowledge in your writing. The first is through reproducing data in your thesis. What I mean by that is including direct quotations or pieces of text through reproducing images, perhaps that you're using, images of artifacts that you might be looking at. It could be including statistical analysis, any sort of raw data, if you will, that you would like to include to show your reader exactly what's going on, that rich detail. And it can be your summarized descriptions of that rich detail. And then a second way you can do it is that you can start including your understandings of the data using your own knowledge. So this is when you would start providing your reader with some interpretations or explanations of the data. And when you start developing claims based on your own interpretations. So let's have a look at this. What does this actually look like in concrete terms? All right, so when we are reproducing, as I said, you can just be presenting the data. So here we've got a quote from an interview transcript. It's something the participant has said, and it's something that the writer has felt is quite important for the reader to get a sense of firsthand. Okay, so that's how you can incorporate really context-dependent knowledge. You can also summarize data. So here from a quantitative study, table 4.4 shows that elementary occupations or unskilled work formed a similar percentage amongst natives and South African or internal migrants in comparison to the working population as a whole. All right, so here they are providing sort of a summary of stats that has been included in the thesis. All right, so that's the first sort of step in terms of reproducing. So that's when you're working really closely with your data, really giving your reader a sense of what's going on. Okay, then you might want to just stand back from that and start writing in a way that is starting to tell your reader what's going on in that data. So you can start by developing understandings of that data. And we do that in two ways. We can start interpreting data, explaining things, and then we can start constructing claims about the data. So in the first instance, here's an example. The writer is saying she, so the participant that she's talking about, she renegotiates her earlier position on the topic that parenting should be a team effort and not determined by gender, as evidenced by the words but and also in the first sentence. So here the writer, the author of this PhD, is commenting about the data. She's explaining the data to her reader. So she's probably just presented some from the interview transcript, and now she's explaining it. When we sort of step one step further away from that, we can then start generating some claims based on what has been explained. So this is from a different study. So here the author is saying, irrespective of one's level of education or occupational status, there is a vulnerability Zimbabwean male migrants experience for their quality as outsiders. Okay, so at this point, some data has probably been presented, it's been explained to the reader, unpacked a little bit, and now the author is sort of standing above it and claiming something about that data. He's making an argument. He's presenting a position on that data. Okay, so that is the key sort of the key ways of generating quite rich descriptive knowledge that's bound to the context of your study, but in ways that sort of step your reader through what's happening there, working from the very rich details to more of the explanations around those details, and then generating some claims. All right, when we look back at the other end of the spectrum, when we are building more abstract knowledge, we can do this in two main ways. The first is broadening the knowledge base by drawing on existing knowledge in the field. And what I mean by that is it's when you start to draw on existing studies in the field that you are using to compare or contrast your findings to. So what is available in the field already, and how does that link to what you have produced? Have you confirmed other people's findings? Is your study disputing existing findings? Is it advancing certain positions? What is the relation? You need to make that explicit in your writing for your reader. Don't just expect them to know. Okay, we can also broaden the knowledge base by drawing on theoretical concepts. Some disciplines will do this more explicitly than others. I'm going to show you quite an explicit one. But it's when you start incorporating your theory into your understanding of what's going on in your context. At the very end of the spectrum, we've got advancing new knowledge. And that's when you are making claims that are based on your data and on the discussion of your data that has already taken into account what already exists in the field. So it's this generally comes at the end of chapters, perhaps maybe the end of sections as well in a smaller way. But it's when you are really sort of standing back from the study, you've explained the data, you've interpreted it, you have shown your reader the implications of it, you have linked those to the field, you've unpacked it using theory, and now you are in a position to really offer something novel to the field. And these can often be empirical findings based on the whole data set, or you could potentially be contributing theoretical advancements to the broader field. So this is when you really are pushing the boundaries. So let's have a look at these two steps in turn. So we've got broadening and we've got advancing. So let's have a look at broadening first. So as I said, you can broaden by linking up to empirical studies and by branching to theory. So here's an example of drawing on empirical studies. So here we've got these results provide support for previous research by Board 2007 and the Trust 2006, who both found government effectiveness to be related to HIV policy making. Okay, so here the author has explained these results. He has described, taken his reader through them, and now the author is able to show how they link up to existing research in the field. a relatively straightforward thing I think we are all fairly used to doing. Branching to theory, let's have a look here. So here the author is writing, in terms of Bourdieu's 1986 theory, different forms of cultural capital, okay, that's a theoretical concept, exist and may be interchangeable at different times in determining one's authenticity and social value. For example, in this instance, one's value as a real township boy. Some boys may not have objectified cultural capital, such as cars and money, but they may not have cultural capital such as skills to win girls over and the right kind of township clothes that authenticate them as real township boys. So here the author is using this concept of cultural capital to really push this explanation even further. So he could describe how his participants didn't have cars, that they might have cars and money, but maybe not the right kind of skills. But here he's actually using the theoretical concept of cultural capital to unpack that in a slightly more abstracted way. And by doing so, other people who use Bourdieu's theory can then make those connections quite easily beyond the study. So that's how it's able to sort of lift that analysis up into a more abstract realm. When we are thinking about advancing new knowledge, here are two examples. As I said, the empirical and the theoretical different accounts. So here the author has said, as has already been shown in this thesis, the occupational structure of the Johannesburg region is tending towards increasing professionalization rather than polarization. So this is really, as I said, at the end, here we can already see, as has already been shown in this thesis, the student here is right sort of at the end, is looking back on the analysis that has been presented and explained and theorized, and she's now able to take a position on that. Similar to the theoretical abstraction, here the author says, the findings significantly elaborated the theoretical understanding of the role of primary appraisal constructs in the stressful transaction and suggest that their influence is highly intricate and has varying impacts across time. So again, really at a stage now where the student is able to offer the field something new, something novel that the data and the analysis in the thesis has been able to provide at this point. So I just want to say, yeah, before we move on, that it's quite hard to sort of cherry pick examples like this to show you, because writing unfolds in a much sort of a longer way in a thesis. So I've tried to just take snapshots here just to give you a little taste of what these things might look like, because I just find having something really practical to understand an idea through is quite useful. But these are not perfect examples, but they give you a sense at least. And we will work through a text in a minute that sort of can put them together a little bit more smoothly than just giving you random little sections to draw on. All right. So what is the payoff of even having these different categories, of separating the stuff out? The payoff is that we get a sense of a writing tool. So when we put these different kinds of meanings together, we get this table. So you will remember we had the continuum that I explained at the beginning of more abstract knowledge, less dependent on our context, to concrete knowledge, which is dependent on our context. Okay. Within that, you will remember that we made this distinction between meanings related to the context of your study and meanings that are located beyond your study, that already exist in the field. And what I've tried to do here is show that if we work within these 4 steps, we are gradually moving up and down between these 2 contexts. And it's helpful because we can often get stuck in a particular step. So what I mean by that, let's go back to that thought I made you ponder over earlier on when I said, what kind of feedback are you getting? Are you getting feedback that your stuff, your writing is really descriptive? Are you getting feedback that your writing is really jumpy? What may be happening if you are someone who has got feedback from your supervisors, say, this is really descriptive and it's like detail after detail, data after data, and I don't know where you're going with this, or you need to come up for air at some point and tell me what this all means. It might be that you are stuck down here in reproducing. You might be so into your data and so excited by your data that you're including too much of it almost in your writing, and your own voice is not coming through. Perhaps your supervisor is saying that you're making a lot of claims here, and I'm not seeing how you are substantiating these claims. Where is this in the data? Perhaps then you are stuck at understanding. So maybe you are jumping to making claims and you're not actually showing your reader where those claims came from or what informed them. Okay, so you might be stuck here. Another very common one is when you start to use theory, especially for those of us who use quite explicit theory, so you're using actual terms like cultural capital, that sort of thing. You might give a quote, so you might give a little piece of your data, and then you might say, this is an example of cultural capital. And your supervisor might say, no, you need to tell me more. Why is it an example of cultural capital? How are you using this? How did you get there? What might be happening is that you have shown a bit of data, so you've done some reproducing, and then you've jumped straight to broadening. So you've jumped to your theoretical concepts straight away. And what's happened is you've missed out a step where you've actually explained to your reader what's going on and how you got to that interpretation. Okay. We're going to use these to have a look at a text now. And I'm hoping this is going to make sense. Can I just stop at this point very briefly and just say, are you still with me? I know I've thrown a lot of information at you, but we're going to use this little tool now to work through a text so I can show you exactly how it works. But I just want to see if there are any really, really lost souls out there that would like to ask a question, or if I should carry on. Okay, I'm gathering by the quiet chat and no hands that I can carry on. So let's keep going, and then we'll have more time at the end to go over anything else. All right, so let's have a look then at how we can use this tool. Okay, so we've got a question there from Mary. Which of these writings come into the discussion chapter? Okay, discussion chapter. Mary, do you want to just tell me quickly? I'm presuming that we are working with the discussion chapter, but do you perhaps work in a discipline that has a findings chapter and then a discussions chapter as 2 separate things? Yes, you do. Okay, great. All right. I'm going to come to that. So this would probably be, the steps are relevant to both, but I'm going to come to it. So if I haven't explained adequately by the end, come back and ask me again. Okay. But I'm hoping it's going to become clearer to you. Great. All right. So we're going to have a look at two texts, one from psychology, one from economics. The first one, I'm just going to give you a very, very quick snapshot just to contextualize it a little bit for you. So this researcher was looking at men in reproductive research and about males' involvement in decisions regarding parenthood, about whether to have kids, when they do have kids, what kind of decisions they make within that space. Okay, so that's kind of your very brief 10-second introduction to a very rich study. All right, so let's have a look at this. I'm going to give you a few minutes just to read this on your own, and then we will go through it, thinking about the tool. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. If you haven't quite finished, don't worry, because we're going to come back to it. So if we have a look at a text like this, and we think about those steps that I introduced. So let's just remind ourselves. So we've got reproducing at the bottom, understanding your data. So this is reproducing bits of your data, understanding your data, broadening those understandings out to the field, and then advancing the position. Okay, so the text that we've just looked at, I'm going to say straight away, doesn't have advancing because it's taken right from the very middle of a chapter. So she's not quite there yet. So don't worry about advancing for now. We're just going to focus on these first three steps. All right, so if we relook at that text using those colors, so we've got pink reproducing, green understanding, blue broadening, then we can see something quite interesting happening here. So the dead giveaway for broadening is obviously when you start citing studies. So that's an easy one to look for when you've got in-text citations. So what is really useful for me here is seeing how these different steps, how the author uses them in the writing and how they are present in the writing. So in this example, she has started this piece of text here by first broadening out and sort of setting up an understanding based on the field and some theory there as well. Okay, so she's introduced a position, essentially. And then she shows how that position relates to her study. But she doesn't just go straight from that position to her data and then expects her reader to make sense of how that's linked. Instead, she provides that crucial line highlighted in green. For example, the following extract argues that parents are better able to relate to same-gender children. So here she's created a bridge between step number 3 and step number 1. So now she's going 3, 2, 1, if you think about it like that in terms of the steps. She hasn't jumped, okay? And in that sense, she's kind of, I like using the metaphor, she's holding the reader by the hand and she's saying, come with me. Here's a claim. Now I'm going to show you how it relates to my study. Then in the pink, in that quotation from her interview data, she's providing the reader with a real inside glimpse of what that looks like in her study. So it's not just her interpretation of it. She's actually saying to the reader, look, here it is. Look how it plays out. Here's an example. But then she doesn't leave her reader there to let him or her work out what's going on in that extract. Instead, remember the hand-holding, she then explains it to her reader explicitly. So she says, in this extract, Anel, who's obviously the participant, expresses support for equally shared co-parenting, as given by the egalitarian gender scripts, yet she ultimately talks against this in order to argue for the distinct roles that women and men, that should be play in their children's lives. All right, so she is really unpacking what her participant has said that's shown in that little extract, and she's talking her reader through it. She's explaining it, and then she is starting to generate some claims in it. So you can see here, she starts off with more sort of explanations, and then she starts forming claims based on that. So here we've got women are constructed as being able to relate to daughters more easily because they have certain experiential knowledge that men do not. Okay, she's shown the data, she's explained the data. Now she's starting to generate some claims, the sort of implications of what's happened. And she works her way to a point that then she can link it back to the field in a way that makes sense. So she starts off by drawing on the scholar. She shows how it relates to her study. She's worked her way to generate some claims about it. And now she is in a position to sort of speak back to that research that exists in the field. So you can see here how she doesn't just work at a very abstract general level on what other people have offered the field, because that would all be blue. She also doesn't just get stuck in the data and what the data is saying and the summaries of the data, because that would all be pink. And she also hasn't just stuck to her own interpretations. That would all be green. She's actually woven different parts together. And I think I would argue a very explicit way that shows the reader exactly what's going on in her head. And that's how you take the reader along with you, and you start building your case for findings. And I think here that understanding the green step, so remember here, the understanding, I think that's actually a really important step in developing your voice, showing your voice. You might have also got feedback saying, I can't see your voice in this. I think that's where your voice comes through quite a lot, actually. And then by broadening out, you also start to assert your authority on it. But I think a lot of people don't give enough attention, pay enough attention to actually the understanding step of that unpacking that needs to go into it. All right, let's consider another example that's going to be quite different, just to show you how this can work across different subject areas. And I have chosen for this workshop the more explicit sort of social sciencey type of writing, but this was evident in English literary studies. It was evident in history studies. So it's across the realm. All right, so here is the next example from economics. And let's just go back here and very briefly, another really rich, interesting study, but in 10 seconds, the study developed a conceptual framework. And then that conceptual framework was used as an interpretivist scheme in analyzing the evolution of the South African invasive alien species regulatory reforms under a particular environmental act. All right, and the focus was on trout farming. So let's have a look. So we're looking at trout farming now. We have moved from parent decision-making processes to trout farming. So let's have a look. I'm going to give you another few minutes to read it on your own. All right, it started again. All right, so just very quickly, what could have been seen as quite big jumps between these categories, broadening and reproducing, is sort of evened out by the author's own voice coming in, shown in green here, in that he makes the connections very explicit. And that's what helps hold the reader's hand as they work through this text. Okay, then he elaborates further, showing his understanding of what's going on in the data in the next paragraph. And then he links that back up to findings that already exist in the field. And then he shows a however. So he's showing how his findings contrast. He explains a little bit, and then he gives a sense of the data. So he takes his reader back into the data to show the evidence for that interpretation that's come there. And then he explains a bit more for the reader by the end of this paragraph. So again, it's really hard to sort of show these steps very effectively when I've got to pick such a tiny piece of writing that fits onto a slide. But I'm hoping you already get the sense here of how these steps come into writing and how they might look different according to your different discipline, according to your writing style, according to the argument you're trying to make. So they look different, but they are all there, even though they're used in slightly different ways and in different patterns. And again, I think it's really useful to keep them in the back of your mind so that if you are feeling stuck somewhere, that you can actually come back to them to think about, am I stuck in one step? Is the problem that I'm jumping all over the place? What is going on? All right, so what I would like to do now is just to give you a bit of space to think through some of these ideas. And what we're going to do, we've got half an hour left, just for 10 minutes. So please don't disappear. I know breakout rooms freak some people out. Please don't disappear. You're going to be in there for 10 minutes. It's going to go so fast. But what I want to do is, because I've sort of thrown quite a lot of information at you, I just want, it says 15 minutes, I'm going to make it 10. It's just be in a room and just talk through with the people that you found yourself with, just about this tool. Do the steps make sense to you? And if so, what would they look like in your studies, to share with each other? You know, what would your data look like? Would it be literary texts that you join on? Would it be interview data? Would it be stats? What would it be? And start to think about the kind of pattern. And that's going to come back to the question that was asked earlier, about perhaps people are writing dissertations in disciplines that value a results chapter or a findings chapter and then a discussion chapter, something separate. And I want you to think about that. What would the steps look like or mean for you in comparison to somebody else in your room? Okay, so just a few questions. What I will do now is quickly just pop this link into the chat. So if you click on that link, you will be able to get access to the table of steps, just so you have it in front of you if that helps. If you can remember the steps without it, that's fine too, but I just thought it might be useful for someone to share a screen and put that up. All right, so breakout rooms, let's do. All right, we're going to do, so there will be about 5 of you in a room. So it's going to be a pretty short discussion. Please don't go away, please come back. 10 minutes only, just have a little chat about what this all means to you. Okay, welcome back everyone. It looks like we are mostly back in the room. So I'm hoping that gave you a little bit of time to chat to some colleagues, some peers, and just to work through to process a little bit of what we've dealt with this afternoon. We're almost at the end. I've just got 2 more slides. So I'm going to keep going and then I will stop to take some questions and comments from you based on what you've discussed and anything else that stood out for you. I'm hoping you are still seeing my slides. Yeah, you should be. All right, so just thinking about this from a sort of broader level, we saw those 2 texts. They both use the same steps, but in slightly different ways. And that's going to happen in your own writing as well. As I said, according to your discipline, that will have some sort of say over it, and also just in terms of your own writing style. But if you can imagine a text, maybe it's a chapter, maybe it's a page, whatever you want it to be, in this block, in sort of time, and you think about the start of the text being here and then how it unravels over time, what we can find then is that some studies might start with their data, and then the author might tell you a bit about that data and unpack it for you, and then they might show you a little bit more data just to convince you, and then they might unpack it and make some claims, and then link those claims up to literature in the field, and then gradually follow the same sort of pattern until they're at a stage where they feel that they can advance new knowledge to the field. A different kind of scholar or different kind of author might start, like we saw with those two texts, they might start with some claims that other studies have made, and then they might explain what that means. At that stage, they could go straight to data, or they might take it back and explain a bit more and then go to data, explain to the reader a bit more, and then spend a longer time in the data. That could be a different way of doing it. And coming back to Mary's question, other studies might do this stuff in two chapters. So what you might find is that there's sort of a chapter break here, and that first findings or results chapter, you might find, and Mary, maybe you can tell us later, you might find that first chapter works a bit more here, and then when you go to the discussion, then you start moving to the other steps and perhaps dip down into your data at some stage just to provide some extra evidence for what you're saying. So the steps can be used in very different ways. But what I did find is that those steps were present in all of the different studies that I looked at. So then just a final slide just to wrap things up, and then we'll open up for some questions and that. So when thinking about this little tool that I've introduced today, it's really not like groundbreaking stuff. I think we know that we've got to do these things in our writing. We can sort of get a feel for it in other people's writing, but sometimes it's just really beneficial to have it spelt out for you in very explicit terms about this is what's happening here, this is what's happening there, and these are the sort of patterns that we can make using different combinations of those steps. And then to go away from this and think about, what this means for you and your writing, and do you think you are actually using those steps and moving between them successfully? Do you think the steps could help in the conversations you have with your supervisor to try and make the feedback a little bit more clearer? Maybe even one of you today, one or two, have thought, oh, that's what the supervisor was talking about. I think it is quite useful as sort of a talking point to have that discussion with your supervisor. Disciplinary differences definitely come into play, as I've already said. Even the way different disciplines structure a thesis, but also in terms, I found a lot in the history dissertations, for example, would spend a much longer time sort of working with the data and providing explanations and interpretations. So kind of working with those first two levels for longer chunks before sort of branching back out into the field, than say the psychology example I showed you. So they each sort of had their own flavor, but what was really interesting is that they were all sort of using the same steps, just in different patterns. And that really does point to the fact that, unfortunately, with most writing things, there's not a straightforward recipe I can just give you to say, if you do it like this, it will be a success. Instead, what I'm saying is, here are some building blocks, here are some Lego pieces, and it's still up to you to manage those and to build it and structure it in the way that feels right for you and that feels right to your supervisor. But I think just having a more sort of explicit understanding of what those blocks are can be quite helpful. So I'm hoping that it has been helpful. And also, again, just to come back to that point I made at the beginning, is that you're not expected to know how to use the building blocks when you first start. It's part of the learning curve. So I also don't want you to feel despondent if you think, I don't use these steps, or it's just not making sense. The more times you go through drafts of writing, the clearer it will become. And maybe even you could go back to some of your older writing and think to yourself, what was I doing here? Was this a potential opportunity to move to a different step? And use the tool in that way, sort of after the fact, to go back to your writing and think, what happened there? What did I do well? What could I do differently? All right, so that is it from my side. So now I'd be keen to hear if you have any comments or questions or concerns, or Mary, what did you make of that distinction, if you are still in the room?
Oh, sorry. Yes, it's very helpful. I just don't know. I think maybe it would be helpful when you are, as you mentioned, looking at your own writing to see, have you included some, those different steps? I think it might be difficult. It's difficult to keep those steps in your mind as you're writing, but I certainly think it's helpful to kind of check, have you left your reader wondering what's in your mind? Because often you already know what you want to say, and sometimes you feel like you've said it. So maybe those steps help with that.
Yes, thank you so much. I think two really important points. The last one there, you often think that you have that you've told your reader, because you know it so well in your own head that you have made it clear, and sometimes you just haven't spelt it out enough. And then your first point, I really want to emphasize here, I don't think it is going to be productive at all to try and write kind of using these steps as a recipe. I think you're going to get yourself so constrained by thinking, have I done this now? Now I need to do that. There are no rules about, time spent in step one to time spent in step two. I think it's far more useful if you just write and then come back and say, what has happened in this text? What steps have really come through? What steps are perhaps missing? And then particularly when you get feedback from your supervisor, to try and understand exactly what they are saying to you. I think it's really useful, but don't hang on to this too tightly. Rather keep it as like a diagnostic tool to think about how you could improve and where things are working, where things are going wrong, than to use it as a formula to write in the first place. So I hope that's clear. And yeah, no, hang on, there's one more here. So Esther is saying, can one apply all or some of this linking steps when writing the proposal, especially in the introduction? If no, what is the linking steps? So that's a very interesting question. I developed the steps from looking at findings chapters in dissertation. So I don't think it would work exactly the same, but I think the principle of having different steps is still really useful. And I think particularly when it comes to showing your own understanding and explaining of things, I often think of this in terms of writing literature reviews as well, that that element of your voice is so often kind of the glue that's holding other things together. So even in a literature review, when you are discussing other people's work, it's sort of how you are creating links, how you are explaining things, creating connections, interpreting things. So I think there's definitely the principle of the steps is definitely there for all sections of writing, but it just might look a bit different. And I'm afraid I don't have a nice neat table for that. Esther, so sorry about that, but yeah, maybe this will be a starting point to help you think through that. Anthea, a request, follow-up workshop where we get to work with our own data. Okay, fantastic. I hope you've put that in the evaluation, Anthea. Otherwise, I will definitely pass that on to the CPGS as well. Emily's saying, can I use different steps across my discussion chapter, or should I stick to the same approach? Emily, do you want to elaborate a bit on that?
Hi, Kirsten.
Hey.
Yes. I was just wondering if in my discussion chapter I can follow the same steps in terms of starting with maybe understanding, going to broadening or reproducing, or the discussion that I'm making on a specific topic will dictate how the steps will unfold. Or is it advisable to stick to the same kind of a similar flow of steps throughout the chapter, or can I interchange in terms of the steps that I'm using?
Oh, right. Okay, I get you. Yeah. Okay, so you keep repeating the same pattern.
Yes. Yes.
I don't think, I would say no. You can mix it up as much as you like. I think that's where your personal writing style comes in a lot. And the key is not to get too fussed about, am I starting, let's go back here just because it's a nice open one. I think it's not about, is it right or wrong to start here at understanding and then go down to reproducing and then up. That really doesn't matter. Whether you start in broadening and then come down, or stay in broadening for a bit and then come down, that is entirely up to you and the argument you're making and how you want to make it. The important thing is if you look over a chunk of time, like perhaps over a page, 2 pages, have a look and see, are you gradually moving through the steps? I think that is much more important than having a particular kind of pattern.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kirsten.
Sure. Can these steps also be used when writing an article? Yes, they definitely can. So any kind of research writing where you are making claims about a phenomenon that you've got some data on, absolutely. And they might actually be a bit, my thinking, I don't have the research to back this up, but my thinking is that you might need to move quicker through the steps just because you've got less time than in a thesis. But that's just something I'm assuming, yet to be tested and verified, but that would be my thought. But yeah, definitely can use these steps. Any other questions or comments? Okay, if not, then let's wrap up because we are just out of time. It's 4:30 on the dot. Just to say thank you so much, everyone, for sticking it out with me this afternoon. I really hope this has been useful, something to keep in the back of your mind as you write your findings chapters, and perhaps something to use when you are trying to understand your feedback and when you're trying to understand how you can improve your writing. So yeah, thank you very, very much for being here and good luck with your studies.